Hello, welcome to Hove, where we are recording episode 69 of the CRICKETher Vodcast. We are of course here for the second T20 International between England and India, which we will come to in a minute. But first up, following on from our discussion in last week's episode about high-profile Australians pulling out of the 100, we have had some more news this week on that note. Ellyse Perry has pulled out for, quote, personal reasons. Is this the final nail in the coffin of the women's 100, Sid?
I'm not sure it's the final nail in the coffin, but it is very disappointing, isn't it? Beth Wild did some interviews, and even just reading back her quotes, you can hear her head in her hands as she was giving those quotes. Up until this point, they'd still been able to go. We've still got Ellyse Perry, guys, and that was actually said a couple of times in the last week when the other people like your Meg Lannings and your Megan Shoots and all that pulled out. But she's obviously decided as well that the whole thing that she would have to go through in order to play just isn't worth it. So it is very unfortunate, isn't it? And it does it make a bit of a difficult thing about the whole thing of it's the world's best players. Well, is it really the world's best players anymore, Raf?
Yeah, and I think that one of their big reasons for delaying it by a year, because obviously it was meant to launch in 2020 but didn't because of COVID, and the ECB did really agonise about putting it back, and one of their big reasons for not just holding it last summer behind closed doors was, well, we want to make sure that the best players in the world can play, particularly that's important for the women's competition. So delayed it by a year, and unfortunately here we still are, kind of in the throes of COVID, and there are still issues with having those best players coming to England. So yeah, it is really disappointing. Now the squads for the 100 have basically kind of been announced, haven't they, Sid? Do you think that that's happened a little bit early, given that there's still lots of domestic cricket being played at the moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? We have seen a couple of instances where we've got players in squads that are not playing regularly in the regional competition, but because they were, the more informed players, perhaps over the winter, they were looking better in the nets, they got selected for the 100, and then when it's come to the regional competition, and of course the other side of that coin is that means that there's some players in the regional competition that are performing well enough to have broken their way into sides that aren't actually playing in the 100. So I do think that as a sort of thing that they might want to bear in mind in future is being able to hold back a few of those places a bit longer, perhaps right up to the last minute, to allow teams to bring in people that are performing in those regional competitions, which after all that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah, we saw, I commentated on Madeline Blinkhorn-Jones making a half century for Surrey against Middlesex in the London Championship on Monday. So she'd be the kind of player that's sort of coming up through the ranks, wouldn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that those players will obviously have their chance next year, but it's a pity they couldn't put themselves in a position where they could bring in those formed players, particularly as they are going to be struggling for the big stars this year. Anyway, talking of form players in regionals, Emma Lamb, she whacked another 100 at the end of last week. 100 off a lot less than 100 balls. Obviously in fantastic form, Raf. Some people are saying she should be here in Hove playing for England today. She's obviously not. Should she be?
Great question. Well, it was certainly a brilliant innings for the Thunder on Friday, wasn't it? Fantastic for her, and she is certainly in really good nick, as you say. I think it's sometimes forgotten that she did go on tour with England, one winter tour a few years ago, and Mark Robinson did certainly he sort of had his eye on her in terms of a future England prospect, but she never actually played a full international on the tour. She played in a few warm-ups, I think, and then was sort of slightly discarded by Mark Robinson.
Yeah, Mark Robinson saw her very much as a bowler who could bat a bit, and I think that as she'd come up through the ranks as a teenager, she'd definitely been looked at, but more generally as a batter, and I think that what she's showing now is that she definitely on form at the moment, she's definitely a batter that bowls a bit, but that's the way that Mark Robinson saw it.
Okay, but obviously regionals does represent a big opportunity for her to break back into England selection as a real prospect, and I think that she's rightly is being viewed in that regard now, which is great. She's obviously been handed her first professional contract last year, and does have that opportunity that perhaps previous generations wouldn't necessarily have had. In terms of should she be opening the batting for England today in the T20 against India, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you have to then go, okay, well, who do we drop in order to make way for her? Now, probably the only player whose place is potentially at risk would be Danny Wyatt, who we saw was not in contention for the ODIs. She was left out there and has been recalled. Now, she did make runs against India in the first match at Northampton. That's true, but they didn't look the best runs that she's ever made in her England career. It's probably fair to say. It's kind of continuing a little bit of a theme for her this season of making ugly runs, looking a little bit scratchy, but still, I guess doing a job for England at the top of the order. Is Emma Lamb suddenly going to appear at Hove today or Chelmsford on Wednesday? No, she's not, because that's not how England operate at the moment. They don't call people up in the middle of a series. However, potentially, if she has a good 100, there may be a case for her in the New Zealand series. Sid, what do you think?
Well, it's certainly possible. I think that we've certainly seen. Okay, so England's ODI team, Heather Knight's pretty much said she knows the 11 players that she's hoping to take into the World Cup in New Zealand in 8 months' time, is it? And I think that it's also the case. The other focus at the moment is the Commonwealth Games. Heather Knight desperately wants to win a Commonwealth Games gold medal, and I think that she's pretty sure about the 11 players that she wants to take the field in Birmingham when the Commonwealth Games starts next year. And it's going to be. You're going to have to work quite hard to kind of persuade her that she's made the wrong choice right now, because she's made her decision largely. So yeah, if Emma Lamb performs extraordinarily well and Danny Wyatt doesn't perform well over the next few months, then possibly she has a chance of breaking in. But honestly, I think that Emma Lamb's chance is going to come after the retirements start to come, after the Commonwealth Games and after the next T20 World Cup, which is following on from that. I think that's the point. Emma Lamb's still young. She's got plenty of years of cricket in her. She will play a lot of matches for England in the future, but I'm not convinced that she's going to play any this year.
It's certainly a very difficult top order to break into, isn't it? I mean, it took Sophia Dunkley about 3 years to break into the top 6, and we've only just about seen her do that, and she had to make an awful lot of domestic runs in order to really wave her hand up and say, pick me, pick me. So maybe a little while off, perhaps. Anyway, talking of today's match, we are about to head off to the ground at Hove. England won pretty comprehensively at Northampton on Friday, and Heather Knight basically said she thought that it was a clinical performance. Didn't really see that her side had done a lot wrong. Would you agree with that, Sid?
Certainly didn't do a lot wrong with the bat. It's always like somebody's always standing up at the moment. I think my one slight concern at the moment is the batting is possibly slightly carrying the bowling. We can. India batted for 7 or 8 overs, and in those 7 or 8 overs we had a 9 run over and an 11 run over, and that's what I mean. Those things do happen in the power play, but there's also a little bit of a sense of becoming a pattern. England needs to be better at their power play bowling. They need to either be taking wickets or locking things down. You can get away with one or the other. You don't have to take wickets necessarily and lock things down. You can take 3 wickets in the power play, but you concede 40 or 50 runs, and that will be okay. Well, that's not a bad power play. Or if you can keep a team down to 30 runs in the power play, that's obviously a good power play as well. But if you can't do one or the other, then you've got to be slightly asking questions perhaps. And it's all very great to go, well, we took 1 wicket in the power play, but 1 wicket isn't really good enough. You need to be taking more wickets or closing down the runs more, and that's what England will be looking to do today, I think.
Great. I'd love to see Freya Davies given a chance to open the bowling, I have to say, today, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. We're off to Hove. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. See you next week.